U.S. President Donald Trump says he's begun arrangements for a meeting between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia. His comments come after a face-to-face meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymr Zelenskyy at the White House. The two were joined by a host of European leaders who accompanied Zelenskyy to Washington in a show of solidarity. The talks are aimed at finding a way to end Moscow's three-year war against Ukraine. They follow Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska last week. Now, ahead of the talks, Trump spelled out that the discussion would focus on security guarantees for Ukraine and a possible exchange of territory, but only with the consent of Ukraine and Russia.
Essentially, I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I actually think there won't be. I think that's even overrated, largely overrated, but we're going to find out. We also need to discuss the possible exchanges of territory, taking into consideration the current line of contact. That means the war zone. Ultimately, this is a decision that can only be made by President Zelenskyy and by the people of Ukraine working also together in agreement with President Putin. And I just think that's very good things are going to come of it. So I hope we have a good meeting. And if we can have a good meeting, I'll set up a meeting with President Putin. And if you'd like, I'll go to that meeting. And not that I want to do that, but I will do that because we want to save a lot of people from dying. A lot of people are dying, and we got to save them.
DW correspondent Janelle Dumalaon joins me from Washington. Janelle, what's the latest?
David, we're at the end of a very eventful day here in Washington. We know that that meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelenskyy, the European leaders, and the chief of NATO has officially concluded. We know that that meeting was a bit of a two-parter, starting with an official negotiating on the table part in the East Room of the White House. That was then interrupted by a lengthy phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin. That meeting eventually turned into a leaders-only format at the Oval Office. But as I said, that is all over now. We saw Donald Trump posting on Truth Social at the conclusion of that meeting, saying that it was a good meeting with distinguished guests. He said that security guarantees for Ukraine were discussed, where the European countries would take the lead and in coordination with the United States. He also said that thing that you mentioned about how he started to plan for a bilateral meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin, and that bilateral would be followed by a trilateral that included himself. So both very notable things to happen if they were indeed to happen. He said that this was a very good early step towards resolving a war that has been going on for nearly 4 years. Interesting use of the words early step there, leading us to believe perhaps that he is still continuing to manage his expectations about any kind of breakthrough towards peace.
Can we tell already if the European strategy, all these leaders coming together, paid off?
Well, we might have to wait for more detailed reports about what was actually discussed behind closed doors, what was agreed to, before we know what worked and what didn't. It does seem like the tone is cautiously optimistic. Nobody seems to think that things have gotten overtly worse since that Alaska summit. The European leaders clearly came very prepared with their flattery for Trump, but also their exhortations for Trump. We saw the likes of Merz from Germany and Macron from France pressing the case for a ceasefire, especially also because Trump has appeared to lose interest in obtaining a ceasefire. He said as much in that meeting earlier today with Zelenskyy in the Oval Office. But you also had the likes of Stradner from the UK talking about security guarantees that are sort of similar to the mutual defense principles that NATO has. It seems that we could fairly say that a battle of optics has been won here. There was a family photo, a tone of cordiality and cooperation. But the true test will really be in whether they were able to extract durable commitments from Trump that he will be prepared to follow through on.
Thanks, Janelle. Let's speak now with Ivana Stradner, Russia researcher at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a think tank in Washington. Trump is now saying that Putin will meet with Zelenskyy in the next weeks. Do you think Putin's really ready to meet Zelenskyy?
I don't have a crystal ball to tell you whether that's going to happen or not, but I'm not sure that Putin is actually thrilled to see Zelenskyy. If you just start with the assumption that the whole ultimate goal for Putin is to subjugate Ukraine, and he does not even recognize Ukraine as such, that he has no incentive to meet Zelenskyy. The only way that he might actually meet with Zelenskyy if Trump puts additional pressure on him and facilitates that meeting. So that's also another possibility to happen.
Now, Trump took the issue or the question of a ceasefire off the table in these talks. He also took negotiations over territory off the table. Why is that?
So I think President Trump understands very well that Putin's game is indeed to ask for impossible. For example, for Zelenskyy to accept, territory swap, et cetera, and then Zelenskyy would reject such an offer. So Putin would blame Zelenskyy as a non-reliable partner. So in that part, that's not something that we can expect from Ukraine to do. When it comes to ceasefire, I actually think that we have to seek also for ceasefire, because Putin is not a negotiator in good faith. He only says that he wants peace in the long term, but I think it's very important that he sends a crystal clear signal and credible signal by stopping the war right now. To give you an idea why I'm not very hopeful about that, just as Zelenskyy was traveling to the United States, Russia launched another horrible attack on Ukraine. So it tells you really all you need to know, that there is no long-term peace without short-term ceasefire as well.
And notably, Macron and Merz, the leaders of France and Germany, brought it up anyway, even though Trump had said they would not be talking about the ceasefire. Both leaders insisting there needs to be a ceasefire. Do you think they can make any headway with Trump on that?
Look, I think many leaders in Europe understand very well that this war in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine. And both Germany and France understand that Putin's quest is not going to stop at this place. So that's precisely where they have been insisting on ceasefire, to test Putin's resolve, because they understand very well who they are dealing with. What Putin is trying to do is to buy more time. And that's precisely this whole point about, long-term peace agreement is not going to work, because Putin is just going to buy more time, reposition his military, and to continue. My concern is that Putin might play two games. Number one, to make sure that we in the United States, that we actually lift sanctions, which would be a horrible idea. And the second thing is to play the West, especially the US, saying, well, forget about Ukraine, we have business to do. Peace through trade never worked. It will not work this time either. So I'm quite certain that many leaders, including the leaders of Germany and France, understand very well why discussing also ceasefire matters, because they know who they are dealing with.
Researcher Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you.
Always pleasure.
Meanwhile, DW's Ines Pohl asked German Chancellor Friedrich Merz if he would be willing to send German peacekeeping troops to Ukraine.
The question of who should be involved in the security guarantees and to what extent will have to be discussed with our European partners and the US government. What is totally clear is that all of Europe should be involved. This isn't just about Ukraine's territory, it's about the political order of Europe. And there, Germany has a major interest and a major responsibility. So being involved for me is clear. To what extent, we have to discuss that in Europe.
DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker, joins me now. Richard, what did you make of those comments by Friedrich Merz on security guarantees for Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big moment in Merz's communication about this question of security guarantees. And this is not just, in fact, him, also his predecessor, Olaf Scholz, the previous German chancellor. Whenever they were asked about this, they were always like, this is not a question for now. This is a question for later. They didn't want to talk about it. It's a difficult subject. It's a thorny subject. Thinking of might we have to send troops into situations where they could potentially face, the Russian soldiers standing in front of them. But now that moment has truly arrived. So Ines Paul, our Washington bureau chief, posed that question, as we heard there. Merz clearly saying that this is a responsibility for all of Europe. Like, no country in Europe can duck this responsibility if a situation arises where some sort of security guarantees might need to be provided, even to the point potentially of providing troops. And just after that clip that we heard, he also said, one thing that will have to be discussed is possibly discussing within his coalition about whether we might need to go to Parliament to get parliamentary support for a mandate for potentially sending troops in. So really thinking through the potential consequences and the potential steps that would be needed, but indicating that finally that time has now arrived where they have to think through, okay, what are we prepared to offer?
What was Merz's overall take on the day's meeting?
Yeah, it was interesting to see this press conference because he certainly had a feeling of tiredness. You could tell that it had been a long day, a bit like Trump had his long day in Alaska the other day. You got a sense of tiredness coming across from Merz, but also I think a sense of kind of a day well spent. And he did say one interesting thing that he said was that he went into these talks really not knowing how they would go. I think a lot of European leaders were very worried after the Alaska summit, after the red carpet being rolled out for Vladimir Putin, after Donald Trump clapping as Vladimir Putin came down that red carpet, that Trump had almost sold Ukraine out, sold the Europeans out already, and they were going to be fighting a rearguard action. And what they seem to have found is that Trump was much more receptive to the Europeans than they anticipated. And he said there was a pretty kind of structured conversation about the next steps, saying that, step number one will be Trump trying to get Putin and Zelenskyy to talk to each other. Then the next step after that, trilateral talks. So I think a pretty confident message from Merz, better than he anticipated. I think we're hearing similar things from other leaders too coming out of these talks.
DW Chief International Editor Richard Walker. Thank you, Richard.